The eighth conversation is Peace and Conflict, Racial and Tribal Justice. The conversation will be led by Elahe Amani, WIN Chair, Global Council, and Mediators Without Borders. And she'll be joined by Dvorak Major, author, former San Francisco Poet Laureate, and the Honorable Jeff Adachi, the San Francisco Public Defender. Please come up.
It's really, truly my honor to be in conversation with Mr. Adachi and Ms. Major, Dvorak Major. I read quite a bit about what they're doing, the wonderful work that they're doing. And I want to share with something that I just remembered today and shared with one of my friends here, that this year is the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Rights Riot. 50 years ago, Elahe at the age of 13, now you can figure out my age. Elahe at the age of 13 was sitting in the house of her uncle in Tehran. And the television was showing Watts Riot. And my uncle, a social activist in Iran, he told me, Elahe, watch this, watch this. Black people in United States are rising for their rights. 50 years later, fast forward, I'm here in San Francisco and being in conversation on the race injustice in US. On the anniversary of Rights Riot in Los Angeles, the Days of Dialogue opened a conversation around the city of Los Angeles between community and police. And I had the honor of facilitating one of those quote-unquote dangerous dialogues in Los Angeles. So 50 years ago, Watts was predominantly black. Now 70% are Latino. What has changed?
Well, it's really great to be here with you. My name is Jeff Adachi. I serve as the public defender. You probably wouldn't know me unless you were called to jury duty or you're in jail. Then I'm a good person to know. You know, we're here to talk about tribal justice and where justice comes from. And having been a public defender for 30 years, justice springs from injustice. When we talk about what happened 50 years ago, you know, have things changed? Absolutely, things have changed and have evolved. Are we still dealing with the same issues that we were 50 years ago? Absolutely. What is different, I think, is a form of activism that we are seeing now. The issues that we are inundated with about the injustice in our system. There was just, if you go on the gate, SF Gate today, you'll see a video of two officers at a donut shop talking about body cameras and their concern about shooting people. And isn't it terrible if on the video it shows us, you know, shooting this person, and they were joking about it. And I think as we see the proliferation of social media, which is what you were talking about earlier, particularly in the last year, you know, with the killings of Tamir Rice and Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, so many others, and we've had local cases too, Alex Nato. And these cases and these stories that we are now aware of, not only locally, but nationally and internationally, are making a huge difference in terms of how we see ourselves and our role in the social justice movement. And we have made it much more accessible to us. Now, just because you press a like on Facebook doesn't mean that you are suddenly a revolutionary activist. Or if you write a blog. Now, those are steps forward. We still need you know, people who are going to be protesting, who are going to be pushing for policy change, who are doing what you're doing, getting involved with both of your feet, jumping into it, and personalizing and internalizing the injustice that you've experienced and making it accessible to others and being open to other people's stories, which is hard to do, right? We become incensed when we are affected by something personally, but we're not so incensed when we don't feel that it touches us in the same way. I thought I'd just share just a couple of quick things with you in the short time that I have. One is that people often think, well, where did public defenders come from? Does anybody know where public defenders came from? Well, we are the ones who are in charge of fighting for the Constitution to make sure that people are treated fairly and receive representation in court. My office has 95 attorneys and 80 support staff, and we represent over 20,000 people a year. But the reason why we have public defenders is because of one person. Her name was Clara Foltz. In 1873, she decided that she was going to become a lawyer in California. She was a single divorced mother with 4 kids. One problem, the law said that women could not become lawyers. And so she was single-handedly responsible for changing that law. And she convinced the governor and the assembly and the Senate to change that law. And she changed white male, because it said only white males could be members of the state bar, to people or persons. And because of her, it made it possible for not only women to become lawyers, but ethnic minorities. And she then enrolled in law school and was rejected because she was a woman. So she sued Hastings College of Law, where I went to law school, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she was admitted, and she became California's first woman lawyer. Well, she couldn't get a job anywhere, so she became a criminal defense attorney. And if you ever get a chance, read the book about her by Professor Barbara Babcock, a Stanford professor, and you read the transcripts of these cases she tried. She was the only woman lawyer then. And the men would say things like, oh, you can't believe what she says, she's irrational, you know, she's a woman, she's, you know, emotional. And she would routinely just slice and dice her male opponents and win these cases, these huge criminal cases. And so she began writing about the public defender's office in 1893. She gave a speech at the Chicago World's Fair. And she spent over 20 years advocating for a public defender. And in 1921, the Foltz Public Defender Bill passed, and that's how public defenders came to be. And our office was formed in that same year, 1921. And I mention that story because when we talk about these movements for justice, we forget not only how hard it is for us to envision some of the things that are possible, but for people that came before us. I also, you know, want to mention that what we're seeing today is a combination of so many struggles that are happening. It's almost like looking at a quilt. And I think we have to look at it in terms of what is our role, you know, what is our piece of the quilt that we are trying to weave. And when the opportunity arises to do something, right, and you all will have that opportunity, if not today, you know, at various times, you have to step up and you have to do what's right. And that's a hard thing to do because you may not be ready for that. The second story I wanted to share with you is what happened to a deputy public defender in our office. Her name is Jamie Tillotson. She was in our office for 17 years. Great public defenders, fighting in court, trying cases. One day, she's in court. Somebody taps her on the shoulder and says, hey, by the way, there's a bunch of police officers out there trying to interrogate your client. She runs outside. The police immediately tell her to go away. She's explaining to the police that you cannot question my client without my permission. And they said, well, if you keep on doing that, we're going to arrest you. And she said, go ahead. And that's exactly what they did. They arrested her. I got the phone call that she was in jail. And so I ran over there, and they had her in handcuffs on a bench. And I said, Jamie, you know, what happened? And she's like, well, you know, I was just explaining to my client, you know, what his rights were, and they arrested me. And so I talked to the police. I said, you got to release her. And after some cajoling back and forth, they finally let her go after an hour. And I found out that 2 of my deputies had the presence of mind to film the entire thing on their iPhones. And so one of them filmed part of it, and the other filmed the other part. So we strung those together. I put the subtitles in there so you could read it very clearly, and I gave it to the police chief. And I said, hey, you've got to throw this case out, because they arrested her for resisting arrest. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to, submit it to the DA. And so when I watched the video, I mean, it was a piece of art. It was great. It was only like 48 seconds long, but it showed everything that they did, and live in living color. And so we posted that on the internet. In 2 days, we had over 1.5 million views. By the next day, we got 3,300 emails from organizations around the country, saying free Jamie Tillotson. There were public defender and defense offices all over the country who put signs together that said free Jamie and, posted them on Facebook. I mean, hundreds. And it just took off. But, Jamie, on that video, if you ever get a chance to watch it, it's on our YouTube page, tremendously courageous. She stood up at the time that she could have easily backed down. She stood up for her client, a young African-American teenager who was being questioned by the police, and ultimately became a folk hero herself, not because she set out to do that, but because when the time came, she stepped up. The third thing I want to mention is that we have to think about what makes sense for us in terms of going forward. I see so many different groups here, Iranian Women's Circle, individuals who I know are committed to different struggles, and figure out, how do I become part, again, of this greater quilt. In my office, we recently formed an organization called Public Defenders for Racial Justice, and we're focusing on how to litigate issues relating to, like, when we talk about unreasonable bails and disproportionate confinement of minorities, actually doing something about it. And it's something that we can do as public defenders. We are litigating in court, we are fighting these cases, and we see that as our part in moving the Black Lives Matters movement forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Deborah, being a third poet laureate of San Francisco, writing 2 novels and poetry books, what do you feel is the responsibility of an artist in these difficult times of racial injustice, poverty, and increasingly racism in this country?
I'm not sure that racism is increasing. I just have to say off the bat, in my experience, I think that it's just that there was a brief period in American history where people were more polite. And I think that we really have to be real about that. I think that an artist has a responsibility to tell the truth, and that means we need to be able to look in the mirror and see who we are and who we are not just who we want to be, and how conscious we want to be. I know when I was head of the poets in the schools, one of the things that I was taught by Dwayne Beagle was every time we had a gathering such as this, the first thing we had to do was to thank whoever the original people were for their land. That we couldn't just come out and do that. Well, that means you're constantly having to be conscious. You can't be lazy. I can't say, oh, I'm a very conscious black woman, so I don't have to pay attention to Native American struggles. I don't have to think about Asian struggles. You have to be very self-reflective in that. I think that it's critical that we look at what our roles are. It's very good to say, oh, I know the right way, I'm all for justice, I'm all for this and that. But if you, every time you see a young African-American man get scared, think it over. Because very few are violent, and the few who are, a lot of the reason is because they've been treated that, I know that's who you are. I think that you have to look at what your own goals are for what justice is or what violence is and where it shouldn't be. And I think artists need to do that. I think we need to tell the truth. I think we need to put out words about what's vital and what we need to look at. But I think everybody, artist or not, has to do that in a very self-reflective way. I myself was very upset. I know I see you, okay, but I just have to take another minute. At the women who were in the service, who everybody that was all over national TV, they are looking at getting to kill and bomb as well as any other man. I heard no women's upcry against that. saying, why do we want this? Oh, it's more women's equality. Oh, so we can be as violent as men. Whoopee. I think that for artists, it's like that. Rather than applauding, is it an advance or isn't it an advance? And I think we need to be very, very self-reflective about who we really are and what we really do. Not being the victim, but realizing sometimes we are, in fact, the oppressor. And we need to do that and not always hide behind whatever our liberal or progressive stances are. Who are we really?
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for some questions? Yeah, do we have?
This isn't a question. It's I'm going to toot Devorah's horn. I taught in San Francisco for 37 years and worked at inner city schools. And when Devorah was running the Poets in the Galleries program, I brought my youngsters to the galleries. And these were youngsters who really struggled with reading and writing. And they didn't believe in themselves. They didn't believe that they could write poetry. And Devorah showed them that they could. And she would pick one poem, and it was published in a book along with the poetry of other youngsters. And to see their own work in a book was incredible. So I thank you. She made such a difference in the lives of my students. So thanks, Devorah.
I have a question. Where do you think the justice for all is failing?
Well, you know, we can look at the obvious examples. For example, the racist Texas that came out of the San Francisco Police Department. You can look at the rampant corruption and things that happen. But I think one of the most dangerous things that I see is what they call implicit bias. This is a sort of a new term of art. It's been around for a long time, but it talks about the fact that we all of us, default back to certain stereotypes. Devorah talked about, how do you feel when you see a group of young African-American teenagers? Do you grab your iPhone and hold it tighter, right? Do you grab your purse or your wallet? What is your reaction? And what the science has shown, the neuroscience has shown that we actually have a part of our brain called amygdala that responds, right, to fear. And that when you test it, there's a test that Harvard developed called the implicit association test. And you just type that in and you'll find it on the internet. You can actually take a test that will gauge the level of bias that you have, and we all have it. You have bias against people of color. People of color have bias against each other and against whites, men and women. And so I think what's important is that, one, we recognize that it exists, and two, that we take steps to address it. Now, what the studies have shown is that in criminal justice, at every judgment point in the system, that disparities exist. For example, if you're an African American and you're facing a bail sentence or sentencing, the studies have showed that you're more likely to get double based on the darkness of your skin and whether your features are seen as Afrocentric. And so the studies have also shown, though, however, that when this is raised and exposed, and for these judges, when they're told that there's a monitor in the room monitoring whether or not this bias is occurring, and in many cases you're not aware of it, that you can correct for it. So I think that there's a lot to be said about learning about implicit bias, and that it's part of the solution to overcoming, the sort of biases that we're seeing in both criminal and juvenile justice.
I have a question for Deborah. Nelson Mandela once told that the choice of our nation is not whether the past should be revealed, but rather to ensure that it comes to be known in a way which promotes reconciliation and peace. As an artist, what is your reflection on this?
I absolutely agree. Let me say one thing, first of all. I did that test. If you have not, Google it. Implicit bias, Harvard. 10 minutes later, it came out the way I knew it was going to for me, because I actually take a lot of time looking at myself. But you might be surprised. And I'm now requiring it of one of my college classes that's supposed to be a very political class, okay? Now, the fact that I want some reparations, okay? And I want you to have reparations. I want all of our. I think that until people stop saying it wasn't me, it wasn't my generation, I didn't do it. Until there is really a truth. This is what happened. This is why more European Americans have property than African Americans. This is why African Americans' family structures are broken down in the way they are. This is why there are high levels of alcoholism and other things on the little pieces of native lands that are left. Let's tell the truth. Do you guys know that Native Americans never lost a military battle? I know you do. Most people don't know that. So we're talking about smallpox blankets and taking the women and the children because that way the warriors would surrender to save them. We don't know. So first thing to do is to have the courage to look at the history and realize your good position, if you have one, is because of their ugly actions. One of the things my husband's been talking about, he made me look at this book. I hadn't seen those pictures since I was a kid. Babe, what's the name of it? Without Sanctuary. Pictures of lynching, postcards, all like that. Some of those people are still alive. Can we prosecute them? Can we prosecute them? They helped kill people.
There's no statute of limitations.
There's no statute of limitations on it. That to get movements like that started, let's look at the past, and wherever it can be fixed, let's fix it. And stop saying, it wasn't me. My parents just immigrated to the United States in 1920. We had nothing to do with that. My great-grandparents, my grandparents, no. You profited. So I think it's a matter of truth. That's the only place reconciliation is going to come from. And realizing, yeah, you got to share, just like in kindergarten.
And since it
Whatever happened to 40 acres and a mule? What about that history?
That's reparations. That's why I'm saying reparations. Exactly.
Right, and there is precedent for this. The Japanese, my parents and my grandparents were interned during the war for 4 years. They lost everything. My grandfather lost his life. And, it was $20,000 that they got, from the government. And everyone, said, oh, that's never going to happen. They pushed for it, and that happened. So there's precedent for it. It should happen and can happen.
And since this is a woman conference, I just want to remind, how many of you know about Black Lives Matters hashtag? It was a great, but did you know that this project started by 3 black women? Yep. The Black Lives Matters started by 3 black women, 2 whom were queer women, and 1 a Nigerian American woman. So the role of women in addressing not only gender equality, but social justice and racial justice is critical in the fight that we have ahead for a more just and equitable world.
I first of all wanted to just reiterate this point about bearing responsibility. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Iran. I grew up in Iran and I came here when I was 20. But I slowly realized that I still, because I'm Middle Eastern, but I look white, and I still benefit from the way that I look. And I started realizing there is a history behind this, and I started reading more about racial issues a few years ago, and I really, really liked and learned a lot from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. I recommend it to everyone. And my question is about this this issue of bias that we have, and that it exists in institutions and corporations. Things don't change until there are actual resources put into them. That's what I've realized, that it does matter what individuals do, but lasting change comes when there is the money that's going to the police departments for certain things changes, that incentives are changed. Do you see prospects of something like that happening, or it's just going to be like pulling teeth?
No, absolutely. Although it is sort of one battle at a time. Last March, I represented a woman, African-American woman, three children, lived in Dolores Park. She was looking for a parking space and had spent 45 minutes looking for a space. You know how hard it is to park there.
Yeah, it's San Francisco.
And was about to pull in the space, and an officer stopped her and said, "You have to move along." And she said, "No, I've been waiting, looking for a space for 40. I'm not going to move along." The officer, pulled her over. One officer came to to her window, was very nice, and she started filming the officer. The other officer, the partner, came around, and his response was to grab her by the hair so hard. She'd just gotten her hair done, pulled her wig off, and threw her on the ground face down, and she had all these bruises on her face. They held her for about an hour there, and then they let her go. And so our response, she was just terrified. She was even terrified. She'd never been in trouble before. She was a Muni driver. And so what we did is we convinced her to go to the Chronicle. We had a front page story about what happened to her. We also did a study and looked at African-American women in resisting arrest. And what it showed is that African-American women were arrested for that specific crime, resisting arrest, at 6 times the rate of their white counterparts. And we've been looking at those cases, and we found that particularly white officers were extremely likely to arrest anyone who even just mouthed off who was African American, where we didn't see that same treatment for white. So we exposed that. But it was very interesting because if you read the comments, there were hundreds of comments on the news media website, and a lot of them were saying, well, it's an African American woman. She was mouthing off to the cops. If she didn't do that, that wouldn't have happened to her. And those are sort of the prevailing attitudes that are expressed by San Franciscans. We're supposed to be in a progressive city. So by exposing incidents like that, are we creating change? Part of it is that you have to put it out there in the forefront. I mean, we've done that. There were 5 police officers who were convicted in San Francisco because of evidence that we produced showing that they were stealing from people. But what is the deterrent effect? How in the long range, are we able to change behavior based on these incidents? And it's going to take a lot of them. So it is frustrating, but taking action, as I said in the beginning, figuring out where you are in the quilt is a big part of it.
It was a comment and a question. One was, how do you attack such denial that there is a racist problem? And even though we see stuff, even with all the videos and everything, you still have a large segment of people saying it is not, we don't have all of that racism, it's just media blown up. The second part is towards my comment. If you don't look someone and see their humanity, where you can relate to it, and there's always one action you can take. We've recently started in my county where I am, very conservative, a group of us, where we are meeting together on sacred conversations on race. And I'm going to bring a couple of the books that you mentioned for us to use too. And we started out, I was the only black person. Then I started getting some other friends of mine that were other minorities, and people of color, and they started coming. We're a small group, about now up to 20 people that started off with 8. And we feel that it has to start somewhere with these nucleus of seeing each other humanity and being able to look at what does white privilege mean and not be defensive about it, and that the racism is beyond black and white. You have to look at when the European first stepped on the country, and even before. But anyway, that was my comment, but going back to the question is, how do we continue to combat that denial? You know, get silent when I noticed when you first brought up, were there any questions? And there's that uncomfortable, even among progressive, even among liberals, of discussing race.
Let me say, first of all, my cousin gave me the best definition for denial. You know, acrostics where the first letter is the line. Don't even know I am lying. Okay? So first is to realize what denial so often is. I think what you're talking about, small groups and starting it like that. And I think that we, you know, in terms of violence and not treating people as humans, we definitely have to start, not that adults are out of the picture, but let's make it in the schools, let's start with nonviolent resolutions to conflict, which we did have a program in San Francisco, and then of course the money left, that Gina Shibashi started. Were you? Yay. Great program, huh? Yeah, Ish is something else. But it was like that, and that was part of it, was to make people see each other's humanity. And I do think that it's true. Things have to be done on a systemic and institutional level. But you do have to start at home. You worrying about violent men? Women raise those men. And maybe it was women getting hit, and so they took it as an example. Or maybe it was women who thought that was the way for their sons to be macho. I was just telling my husband, I remember when my boy was a little, people would, he's so good looking. And he was such a cutie pie. And they'd go, oh, you have a heartbreaker. I said, not my son. I am not raising a heartbreaker. That there's a level that we have to insist on a responsibility and insist on a courage and about those things and a knowledge, and we have to keep pushing. And you can't, I mean, it's hard. You don't, when you're having a nice party, somebody says something racist, you don't want to be the one to ruin it by saying, you know, that was really rank and racist. Well, have some courage. Do you really want a better world? You know? I think that it's like that, and that means that you are writing letters, you are coming out to marches, you are dealing with discomfort, and there's a big Black Lives Matter, and you come out, of course all lives matter, but since we're the canaries in the mind, keep the canary alive and you'll breathe too, you know? Very simple, you know? So I think it's things like that that we have to do and to push for more and more change, and to not, I mean, I always tell people I stopped teaching racism 101 to white people. I really feel that that's something people that European Americans have to engage each other on. You need to engage each other. You need to look at yourself. You need to do that rather than pull us out to do it for you. You know, because then it's just, oh, that's that mad black lady that's talking, you know? So I think that there's that. But if you want change, you make change. You know, if you want change, you make change. And of course it has to be on an institutional level, of course. But that means at the PTA meetings too. It's just not the big things, you know. That means there too. You know, it means wherever you are. It means in your office place. It means in your school. My cousin was in a meeting where a teacher said, well, you know, most of these kids aren't going to college anyway. They're talking about third graders. Black third graders, they're not going to college anyway. The principal didn't say a thing and stand up. Her other teachers, the white teachers, didn't say a thing and stand up. What are you talking about? These are third graders that you have already written off. You know, so I think there are things we can do when we're talking about institutions. You always think the big one, your institute, that's way too big. You know what I mean? Then that's about those public defenders and other people standing up, and frankly, some prosecutors too, you know? But I think we're all in institutions, and don't just look at the big ones. Look at the small ones. That's how the right wing took over. They started with the boards of educations, the PTAs. And it's the same thing, the reverse struggle, you know.
Just one thing I would add. Your fearless leader, Marilyn Fowler, who I'm a huge fan of, came up with this concept called calling the circle. And when you needed support for an issue, whether it was an international issue or one right in your backyard, you call the circle and you reach out to people who are your allies. But what I always liked about what Marilyn would do is she would reach out to people who weren't your natural allies and bring them into the circle. And that's part of educating folks, is that if you're just going to the same people, one, those people are going to get tired from hearing from you, and two, you're not going to be spreading the message of what you're trying to do. And so it's hard to do that, and you may find a lot of no's and deaf ears, and nobody likes to be rejected. But that's the only way that we're going to make progress is one person at a time.
Thank you. Last.
Hi, my name is Ana Maria Sanchez. I'm Public Defender Jeff Adachi. I'm directing this to you. I wanted to thank you because 20 years ago, I don't know if you remember, I was in a case with my boyfriend at the time who did attempted murder on me. And at that time, you were defending him, and I was being defended by the DA's office. And at that time, I was not exactly liking you. That was 20 years ago. I'm a little bit different now. You're on his side. The guy just tried to murder me. But I want to say thank you because there was something that helped me to see at the very end of that trial that he did when he was sentenced, that you showed your humanity to me, and that made him see the desperation that he had in his eyes when he was trying to do what he was trying to do with me. So, because there was love there before that. Thank you so much, Chef. Appreciate it.
And I bet you're taking your experience and helping to support others, which is golden. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this engaging conversation, for enlightening. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the community, and we appreciate your presence here.